I moved to this town 2 months ago, trying to start over with my kids and leave all the bad stuff behind. My ex-husband was the main reason for this move. The relationship was a nightmare, and even after the divorce, he couldn't accept that it was over. Finding a quiet place where nobody knew us felt like a huge relief, like we were finally safe. The neighborhood was peaceful, the people kept to themselves, and I was starting to believe I had left it all behind. But that was before the night everything fell apart. It was a regular night. The house was silent, my 2 kids were asleep in the next room, and I was in the living room going over some bills before heading to bed. That's when I heard a noise coming from the kitchen window. At first, I thought it might be the wind or maybe an animal, since the street is pretty deserted at night. But then I heard footsteps in the yard. My heart started racing, and I froze. Something felt off. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. That had never happened before. Then I heard the sound of the back door handle rattling, and I felt like my heart stopped. I ran to the kitchen to check if the back door was locked. Thankfully, it was. But the relief didn't last long. Someone on the other side started banging on it, trying to force their way in. And then I heard his voice. There's no way to describe the fear I felt when I recognized my ex-husband yelling my name. He was shouting things that didn't even make sense, accusing me of stealing his kids and saying he wouldn't let it slide. My first thought was to grab the kids and lock us in the bedroom, but I knew that if he got in, that wouldn't stop him. Still shaking, I went to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find. It was the only thing that felt even remotely like protection. He kept yelling and banging on the door, and it was getting louder and more violent. I couldn't understand why nobody in the neighborhood was doing anything about it. I stood near the door with the knife in my hand, praying he would just leave. Then I heard the sound of glass shattering. He had found a way in. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the house, and my first instinct was to run to the kids' room. I locked the door and woke them up, trying to stay calm, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the knife. I whispered for them to stay quiet, telling them everything would be okay, even though I wasn't sure it would be. My older son, who's 10, seemed to understand how serious this was, but my youngest, only 6, started crying softly. I felt helpless, but I couldn't let fear take over. Then I heard his footsteps in the hallway, his voice calling my name, getting closer and closer. He knew exactly where we were. When he started banging on the bedroom door, the panic hit me like a wave. He screamed that he was going to end this and that I'd never keep him from his kids again. I didn't have time to think. I tightened my grip on the knife and, before I could stop myself, I unlocked the door and swung it open. He stumbled forward, nearly falling into the room. He tried to lunge at me, but I reacted without thinking, stabbing him in the shoulder. He fell back, screaming in pain. I never thought I'd be capable of doing something like that, but in that moment, it was him or us. Even so, seeing the blood and hearing his cries was terrifying. I froze, unsure of what to do next. He tried to get up, but he was dizzy and slipped in his own blood. I took that chance to grab the kids and run out of the house. It was dark and freezing, and I had no idea where to go, but I just needed to get them away. I ran to a neighbor's house, someone I barely knew, and banged on the door like my life depended on it. She opened the door, startled, and when she saw me, she let us in right away. I begged her to call the police while I tried to calm the kids down. My legs were so weak I could barely stand, and I couldn't catch my breath. It felt like a nightmare that wouldn't end. When the police arrived, they found my ex still inside the house, injured and disoriented. He was taken to the hospital under custody, and I spent the rest of the night at the police station giving my statement. The officers told me I did what I had to do to protect my kids, but that didn't make it any easier. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and I couldn't get rid of the guilt and the overwhelming relief that we were safe. I kept asking myself if this was really over, or if more trouble was coming. The days that followed were a blur of police, lawyers, and even social workers, all while I tried to shield my kids from the chaos. They were terrified, especially my youngest, who started waking up screaming at night. I tried to stay strong for them, But every time I walked into the kitchen or saw the broken window, the events of that night replayed in my head like a horror movie. The officers reassured me that my ex wouldn't be released anytime soon, but I couldn't shake the fear that he might try something again. The house that once felt like a safe haven now kept me on edge constantly. To this day, I'm not sure how I managed to react that night. Sometimes I think about what could have happened if I hadn't grabbed that knife, or if he had gotten to us first. The guilt and fear still linger, but I try to focus on the fact that my kids are safe. It was the most terrifying night of my life, and even now, I can't talk about it without my hands trembling. All I can do is keep protecting my family and hope he never comes back into our lives again. I've never been the kind of person to share stories online, but what happened to me still haunts me, even years later. I was 15 when I lost my parents in a car accident. It was devastating, but my grandmother, who had always been a distant figure in our family, showed up immediately to take custody of me. At first, I thought it was the right thing. She was the only family I had left. But as time went on, things started to feel off. My grandmother had a strange way of isolating me. She said it was for my own good. She took my phone, banned the internet, and insisted on homeschooling me with her as my teacher. Even small things, like going for a walk or visiting friends, were shut down with excuses about how dangerous the outside world was. I was young, vulnerable, and wanted to believe she was just trying to protect me, but something about her never felt entirely genuine. Slowly, I started noticing strange things around the house. My grandmother was obsessively organized, almost to the point of paranoia. She locked doors at night, even ones that didn't lead outside, and had a cabinet in her bedroom that I'd never seen open. When I asked about it, she gave me this tight smile and said it was just old stuff. I didn't push, but it left me with a weird feeling, like she was hiding something. One day, while cleaning the basement, something she rarely let me do, I found a cardboard box full of old papers and photos. At first, I thought they were just family memories, but as I looked closer, some things didn't add up. There were newspaper clippings about a missing child from the 1970s. The articles mentioned a woman as a suspect, but the case had been dropped for lack of evidence. The name of the suspect jumped out at me immediately. It was my grandmother. I froze. It felt like all the pieces that hadn't made sense before were finally clicking together. But the picture they formed was too terrifying to accept. Why would my grandmother have those clippings? And why had she never mentioned anything about this? I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but the details in the articles were unsettling. The suspect, my grandmother, had reportedly been seen with the child several times before the disappearance, but there wasn't enough evidence to charge her. I knew I needed answers, but confronting her didn't seem like a safe option. I started paying closer attention to her behavior, and the more I watched, the more I noticed how much she monitored me. It was like she was constantly watching everything I did. Even small things, like how long I stayed in the bathroom, seemed to raise her attention. I realized that if I wanted to find out more, I'd have to be careful. One night, I waited until I was sure she was asleep. That locked cabinet in her room had been haunting me for weeks, and I knew that whatever she was hiding was probably in there. I grabbed a hairpin and, with shaky hands, managed to pick the lock. What I found inside left me breathless. Documents, photos of children I didn't recognize, and in the middle of it all, a birth certificate with a name that wasn't mine but matched the year I was born. I couldn't make sense of it. It felt like my whole life had been a lie. I tried to process it in silence, but I accidentally dropped one of the photos. The sound was faint, but loud enough to wake her up. I heard her footsteps in the hallway, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. I barely managed to shove the box back into the cabinet before she appeared at the door, staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, more calculated. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at me in the dark. I mumbled something about looking for a book, but I knew she didn't believe me. Without a word, She walked into the room, slammed the cabinet shut, and left, locking the door behind her. At that moment, I realized I wasn't safe there. My grandmother wasn't who I thought she was, and I needed to figure out what was going on before it was too late. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. She made breakfast, handed me a list of chores, and even tried to start a casual conversation. But I could feel the tension in the air. My stomach was in knots as I pretended everything was normal. As soon as she left to run errands, I ran to the basement. I needed to take another look at those clippings and documents. This time, I dug deeper into the box and found a diary. The first few pages seemed normal, but as I flipped through, the writing became erratic. It was filled with names, dates, and strange phrases like, "She'll never remember and it's for her own good." Reading that diary made me feel sick. It was like everything was there, but the pieces were too scattered to fully understand. One of the names matched the missing child from the newspaper clippings. My mind was racing, and panic was setting in. It explained her obsessive control, her paranoia, and the way she isolated me. She had done something in the past, something terrible, and she was terrified I would find out. I heard her car pulling into the driveway and quickly shoved everything back into the box before sprinting to my room. I tried to act like I was studying, but she stormed in with a look that made my blood run cold. "You've been in the basement again, haven't you?" she said, her voice too calm, like she was testing me. I shook my head, denying it, but I knew she didn't believe me. She stepped closer, and for a second, I thought she was going to do something. Then, without a word, she turned and locked me in my room again. That night was the longest of my life. I knew I had to get out of that house, but I had no one to turn to, no way to call for help. I sat on the floor of my room, listening to every creak and sound from the hallway, terrified that she might come back. When the house finally fell silent, I tried to open the window to escape, but she had already thought of that. The windows were nailed shut, and the tools I'd need to remove them were locked in the basement. By morning, she came into my room like nothing had happened, but her expression had changed. There was something decided in her eyes. "We're moving," she said abruptly, offering no explanation. My heart sank. If we left, everything I'd learned would be buried forever. I knew she was planning to take me somewhere I wouldn't be able to escape or find answers. I wanted to fight back, but when she placed her hand on my shoulder, squeezing just enough to send a message, I froze. I never found out the full truth about my grandmother's past, but one thing became clear. I wasn't just her granddaughter. I was something else, something she felt she could control. And even now, years later, I feel like I've only scratched the surface of what really happened. The fear she left me with still lingers, and I'll probably never know everything she kept hidden. Losing my parents at such a young age left a hole in my life that nothing could really fill. My Uncle Tony stepped in and took care of me when I was just a kid. For years, he was like a father to me, and I genuinely thought of him as my rock. But everything started to feel different when I moved into my own place. At first, it seemed harmless. He'd show up with groceries or tools, saying he just wanted to help me out. I appreciated it at first, but I started noticing that he never asked before coming over. The visits became more frequent and, honestly, kind of intrusive. He'd show up at odd hours, sometimes when I was in the middle of work calls or just trying to unwind after a long day. I tried brushing it off, thinking he just missed having me around. But then, I started seeing him in random places, like at the grocery store or even at my gym. Every time, he had an excuse. "Oh, I was just passing by," or "I thought you might need help with something." At first, I believed it was just a coincidence, but after a while, it was impossible to ignore how often it was happening. I started to feel smothered, like I couldn't breathe without him being there. One day, he randomly showed up at the gym while I was finishing a workout. He stood there, watching me. When I asked him what he was doing, he just smiled and said, "I just wanted to see how you're doing." That sentence gave me chills. It didn't feel like concern. It felt possessive. After that, I decided to set some boundaries. I told him he needed to let me know before coming over and to give me some space. His reaction caught me off guard. He got really defensive, accusing me of being ungrateful and forgetting everything he had done for me. That's when things took a darker turn. He started blowing up my phone with calls and texts, demanding to know why I wasn't answering fast enough. If I ignored him, the messages would get angrier and more passive-aggressive. I knew it wasn't normal, but I didn't know how to handle it without making things worse. One of the most humiliating moments was at work. My boss called me into his office to ask why my uncle had been contacting him. I was stunned and didn't even know how to respond. My boss explained that my uncle had called, saying he was worried about me and asking how I was performing at work. I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. When I confronted Tony about it, he shrugged it off, saying he was just looking out for me. But to me, it felt like he was crossing every possible line. Then, I started noticing even creepier things. One night, I came home from the gym and saw his car parked on the corner of my street. When I asked him about it, he denied being there, saying it must have been someone else's car. Another time, I was out at dinner with a friend, and he randomly showed up at the same restaurant. He didn't even try to hide it. He just smiled and said, "I knew you'd be here." My friend could tell I was uncomfortable and suggested I talk to someone about it, but I didn't know who to trust. Every day, I felt more and more like I was being watched. The night everything came to a head was the scariest night of my life. I had just gone to bed when I heard a faint noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, the sound of someone messing with the front door. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my phone and opened the security camera app. What I saw made my blood run cold. There he was, my uncle, standing at the door, trying to open it. He had something in his hand, maybe tools, and he looked so calm, like this was just normal. I panicked and immediately called the police. I whispered into the phone, scared that he might hear me. I told them someone was trying to break into my house, but I didn't mention it was my uncle. As I waited for the cops, I locked myself in the bathroom, shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. On the camera, I could see him walking around the house, checking the windows, like he was taking his time. It was terrifying because he didn't even seem rushed or worried about being caught. He acted like he belonged there. Waiting for the police felt like it lasted forever. I could still hear him trying the locks and moving around outside. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a patrol car on the camera feed, and I felt a wave of relief, though the fear hadn't completely left me. He didn't even try to run. Instead, he calmly walked up to the officers like nothing was wrong. When I opened the door for the police, I could barely speak. My hands were shaking, and all I could manage to say was, "He's been stalking me." The officers spoke to him outside, and when I explained the situation, they took it seriously. He, on the other hand, just kept repeating that he was only looking out for me. He said it so calmly, like breaking into my house in the middle of the night was just another way of showing he cared. The police escorted him away, and a few days later, I got a restraining order. Since then, he hasn't contacted me directly, but the fear has never really gone away. Every little noise outside, every unfamiliar car parked on my street, still puts me on edge. Even though he's technically being kept away, I can't shake the feeling that he's watching, waiting for a chance to come back. It's like he's left this invisible mark on my life. I moved to a different place, I changed my routines, but the fear he instilled in me has stayed. It's the kind of thing that doesn't just disappear. You carry it with you, always looking over your shoulder, wondering if you'll ever really feel safe again. I remember everything like it happened yesterday, even though it's been a few years. It was supposed to be a chill night, just another one of those gaming sessions at my friend Leo's house, something we did almost every weekend. His mom, Mrs. Renata, was always super nice, bringing us pizza and sodas while we laughed and played on the console. Their house was simple, but you could feel how much effort they'd put into making it a safe and cozy place after Leo's dad left. Leo would sometimes talk about the divorce, but always in a casual way, like he wanted to show he was handling it fine. I never imagined what was about to happen that night. It all started around 10 p.m. We were in the middle of a game, lights dimmed in the living room, when we heard a loud noise coming from the front door. At first, I thought the dog had knocked something over, but Leo froze instantly. He looked at me and whispered, barely moving his lips, "It's my dad." Before I could even process what he meant, the doors slammed open, and there he was, Leo's dad, furious, his eyes wild, and an expression on his face I had never seen before. He yelled Mrs. Renata's name, so loudly it felt like it shook the entire house. Mrs. Renata came rushing in from the kitchen, her face a mix of fear and exhaustion. Like this wasn't the first time. Leo barely managed to whisper "Mom," before his dad started shouting things that didn't even make sense to me in the moment. Something about her betraying him and ruining the family. He was so loud and aggressive, it felt like his words had weight. I just sat there on the couch, frozen, trying to figure out what was happening, while Leo stood up slowly, like he was trying to calm things down. Mrs. Renata asked him to stop, but he stepped closer, and suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. The tension broke when he threw a chair against the wall, and I saw Leo jump in front of his mom, instinctively trying to shield her. That's when I realized things were spiraling out of control. The man stormed toward them, and Mrs. Renata tried to grab his arm, but he yanked away so hard that she fell to the floor. It was like a switch flipped in my brain. It wasn't just an argument anymore. It was dangerous. My heart started pounding, and before I even realized it, I was on my feet, my hands sweaty, my mind racing. I don't know what came over me, but before I could think, I ran toward them. Leo's dad had Mrs. Renata by the arm, yelling things so filled with hate it didn't even sound human anymore. Leo was trying to push him back, but it was like the man didn't even feel it. I grabbed the first thing I could reach, a soccer trophy from the shelf, and held it tight. I just wanted to scare him, but when he made a sudden move, like he was going to hit Leo, my body acted before my brain could stop it. The trophy hit the side of his head. He dropped to the floor with this heavy groan, and the silence that followed was deafening. Leo turned to look at me, his eyes wide with disbelief, like he couldn't process what I had just done. Mrs. Renata crawled backward, leaning against the wall, tears streaming down her face. Leo's dad just lay there for a moment, motionless, before he started moving again, slowly. My stomach churned. I'd never hurt anyone in my life, not even during school fights. And now, here I was, standing over this man I had just knocked down. My heart was racing, and everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. As he started to get up, still dazed, I let the trophy fall from my hand. It hit the ground with a dull thud. For a moment, I thought he might fall back down, but then his eyes locked on mine. It was like staring at an animal, pure rage and pain in his expression. He took a step toward me, and I froze. But then Leo, out of nowhere, stepped between us. "That's enough, Dad," he yelled, his voice shaking but strong enough to make the man hesitate. For the first time, Leo stood up to him, and it was like the spell broke. His dad shook his head, like trying to clear it, then stumbled toward the door and slammed it shut behind him. The house was dead silent after that, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I was still standing there, frozen, trying to process everything that had just happened. Mrs. Renata sat on the floor, crying softly while Leo hugged her, trying to calm her down. Meanwhile, I felt like I didn't belong there anymore, like I was suddenly an outsider. My body wouldn't stop shaking, and my palms were sweaty. That's when I noticed the blood on the edge of the trophy. Not a lot, but enough to make my stomach flip. It felt unreal, like I wasn't even part of what just happened. After he left, the weight of what had just happened hit me like a ton of bricks. Leo was still trying to comfort his mom, but she looked like she was in shock, barely able to get a word out. My first instinct was to look out the window, just to make sure his dad wasn't coming back. The yard was empty, but every little noise outside made me jump. My heart was still pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but nobody answered. It was like we were all stuck in our own heads, trying to make sense of it. After a few minutes, Leo grabbed his phone and called the police. I don't know if he thought they'd arrest his dad or just come to make a report, but the tension in the room was suffocating while we waited. Every second felt like an eternity. My mind was spinning with 1,000 thoughts. Did I overreact? Did I really have to hit him? But no matter how many times I replayed it, I couldn't get the image of Mrs. Renata being thrown to the ground out of my head. Still, I couldn't shake this horrible feeling, like I'd crossed a line I couldn't come back from. When the police arrived, the flashing red and blue lights outside made everything feel even more surreal. I tried to explain what happened, stumbling over my words, my voice shaky with adrenaline. The officers listened, calm and composed. But the way they looked at me made me feel like I'd done something wrong, even though I was just trying to protect Mrs. Renata. They asked her to share her side of the story, but I could see her hesitation. Whether it was fear or just the weight of years of dealing with him, she seemed reluctant to say too much. In the end, they just took a report and told us they'd follow up if he came back. That knot in my stomach tightened. It felt like nothing had been resolved. He could come back anytime. After everything was over, I went home, still shaking. My mom asked why I looked so pale, but all I could manage to say was that I was tired. How could I even begin to explain what happened? That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, unable to close my eyes. The whole scene kept replaying in my mind. His angry face, the sound of the trophy hitting him, the eerie silence afterward. It's been years now, but I still have nightmares about it. I never found out what happened to Leo's dad after that night, and honestly, I never wanted to. What I do know is that I've never felt truly safe in anyone's house ever again. If you enjoyed the stories, subscribe to the channel for more content like this and leave a like to support our work. Thank you.